So here's the latest as it relates to Oregon. You heard, obviously, with the tragic situation still unfolding here in terms of both the injured and also the identification process. We're expecting that we may be hearing from President Obama this hour to be commenting about the shooting. We'll take you live to Washington if and when that happens. But now we move to our other top story of the day and the unfolding situation in Syria that just keep getting messier. Russia has started airstrikes in Syria, but Defense Secretary Ashton Carter is questioning who, in fact, they are bombing.
It does appear that they were in areas where there probably were not ISIL forces, and that is precisely one of the problems with this whole approach.
Now, the U.S. is accusing the Russians of hitting rebels who are fighting the Assad regime instead of going after ISIS. That's pretty dicey for a whole lot of reasons. U.S. is supporting those rebels, in fact, arming them, and the U.S. wants Assad out of power. The U.S. and Russia are not agreeing, to put it politely, but at least they are talking. Here's Secretary of State John Kerry and his Russian counterpart during a tense news conference.
We agreed on the imperative of as soon as possible, perhaps even as soon as tomorrow, but as soon as possible, having a military-to-military deconfliction discussion, meeting, conference, whatever can be done as soon as possible.
The first instruction to us was to make sure that the military of the United States, the coalition led by the United States on the one hand, and the military of the Russian Federation, who now engage in some operations in Syria at the request of the Syrian government, get in touch and establish channels of communications to avoid any unintended incidents.
Well, a short time ago, I spoke with David Tafuri. He's a former State Department official as well as an Obama campaign foreign policy advisor. I guess this is the $64,000 question. I've heard a ton of different theories. I'm curious yours. What is Putin really up to? I mean, nobody thinks this is out of some great love for Assad, but people haven't figured out his end game. This is for leverage, but the question is leverage for what?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. Certainly he wants leverage throughout the international community. He wants leverage against the U.S. Because the U.S. has been critical of Russia's actions, especially in the last few years, especially in Ukraine. But also, Russia is trying to extend its influence in the Middle East, and Syria is where it has the strongest foothold. So it's trying to protect that foothold. Now, Putin talks about the fact that he's trying to protect the sovereignty of Syria, but that's not the real reason he's there. He really doesn't care about the sovereignty of any other country in the world, as demonstrated by how he conducts foreign policy. He's really trying to protect the influence of Russia, especially with respect to the great relationship his country has right now with the current president of Syria, Assad.
Let's say he actually delivers, Putin does, in some kind of configured, brokered peace in Syria. Let's say Syria is its natural borders, currently written constrict. He gives Assad a little bit of a smaller portion. They even broker a time period where Assad goes away. He even hinted as much to that. The U.S. has interest in that. Europe has interest in that. The question is, what if he delivered that? What would he want to trade it for?
That might be a practical solution that might be able to work. The current U.S. position is Assad must go. And that certainly is the position of our allies in the Middle East, and certainly the position of the moderate opposition in Syria, which we are supporting. Now, what would Russia get in return? I mean, certainly it would cause Russia to look to having been reasonable with respect to this issue. And of course, Russia would be able to retain its influence over the Alawite areas of Syria, which would exist in some sort of future Syria. So I'm sure that's what Russia would want out of it. Maybe Russia wants other concessions from the U.S., for instance, cooperation, or at least, hoping the U.S. will look the other way as Russia continues to also expand its influence with the former Soviet satellite countries. So those are all things that are in play for Russia.
David, what's this more about? If you have to try and read the end game for Putin, is it more about Ukraine, or is it more about the sanctions? What's he trying to get at the end of the day, if nothing else is priority one? I know you said extending his influence, and I get that, but he's also probably looking for something else.
I think that's right. I think that he wants it's something he could barter with respect to sanctions and getting the U.S. to ease sanctions. Perhaps he's certainly trying to strengthen his position with respect to what he wants to accomplish in the Ukraine, perhaps in the Baltic states, perhaps in other neighboring countries. So those are all important things for him. But it's also about commanding respect. And Russia has moved in. It's made a big splash in the Middle East now, and he probably thinks that's going to help him command respect. He's also really taking on some liabilities. This is not only upsetting to the U.S. and to Europe, but it's also upsetting to many of the Sunni Arab countries in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, like UAE, even Turkey. And so he's really jeopardizing those relationships. So it's very risky, but I think, again, this is his goal, and this is his way of making Russia relevant in the international community.
There's an unspoken truth that if the U.S. wanted to do this ourselves, we could have turned the bombers directly on Assad here, and we'd have a different reality than we have right now on the ground. But the resistance to do that, among many reasons, but the chief was, we didn't know what was going to follow Assad in Damascus here. Who else was going to run in his stead? Possibly we could even have a scarier alternative. To that end, let's say in the end Assad goes away. Does anyone have an idea what could fill the breach?
Well, I mean, the current proposal that's supported by some in the international community is to have a unified coalition government. It would have to have representatives from each of the sectarian groups and ethnic groups in Syria. Assad would have to step aside, but certainly others, Alawite leaders, would have to play a significant role in that unified government were it to be successful. It's going to be very difficult to achieve, and the longer the civil war goes on, the more difficult it becomes to sort of mend those differences and put together a coalition government.
David, I appreciate a few minutes again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And you are now looking at this again, video of Syria, but I want to show you now a live picture. This coming out of, obviously, the White House. We're expecting very shortly the president to make comments about that deadly shooting at the Oregon Community College, our top story tonight. We will take you there when, in fact, it happens. Stay with us, everyone. RFL back after this quick commercial break.